Hello, and welcome to A New Kind of Dialogue, the podcast. I'm Jane Ball, co-founder of Dialogue Associates, along with Peter Garrett. In this podcast, we aim to bring the concept of dialogue into your life and the way you work. And we're doing this by exploring the chapters of Peter's book, A New Kind of Dialogue. By now, you'll have shared in learnings and moments from chapters 1 through 6. If you've not heard those episodes yet, I highly recommend you go back and have a listen. In today's episode, we're delving into chapters 7 and 8 of the book, Immersed in Dialogue, Consolidation and Dissolution. Make sure you stay tuned for the end of the episode as we invite special guest Matthew Capowski, founder of the Bohm Society, onto the show to pose his questions to Peter. But first, let's get stuck into chapter 7, Immersed in Dialogue. So, Peter, our last episode at the end, we'd seen the birth of a new kind of dialogue in Mickleton, in the Cotswolds, in the middle of England. One chapter later, you're immersed in dialogue. You begin a series of dialogues with David Bohm and others all around the world. To give us some context, can you just describe the overview, some of those locations and countries you went to before we get into the details of what happened?
Well, if I mentioned last time that David Bohm didn't agree to come to the Human Unity Conference until later, and so we had no financial gain for it. And when I said, would you be up for a weekend? He said, yes. At the end of that weekend, there was no doubt we were going to do more. We didn't start a series, we just had another meeting. So we didn't really know where we were. I still had in the background the idea that I might attract him into the spiritual community that would be very good for him and his wife. But what really anchored it was writing effectively the postscript, the final page of the book, and publishing it. Was that what we're involved with is a process of unfolding meaning, a particular kind of inquiry. So as we went forward, David Bohm had quite a following. He wasn't publicly well known, but people who met him and knew him really did track where he was. And because many of them were academic and have to publish every year, they were quite keen to, because he's a good source of interesting stuff to write and talk about. And I, of course, was reasonably well connected with the spiritual groupings. The spiritual group had a community in Israel. And so I knew David during his couple of years in Israel at the Weizmann's Institute had met and married his wife. I thought they would really enjoy going back. Also, Don Factor is Jewish. So I said, well, why don't we do an event in Israel? And the answer was yes. So we found in Jaffa, I don't know how you pronounce it, Jaffa, like the orange. We found a center for kibbutzim. In other words, kibbutz people used to go there and get training and so on. We hired it and we gathered a group there. It was a larger group. It was about maybe 60 people, 50, 60 people, something like that. And there we were in Israel, which was a little more peaceful than it is right at the moment. But there we were.
Tell us a bit about what happened in that first, I guess your second dialogue.
What we did was a number of things. One, we placed the seating in a circle to try and emphasize the fact that nobody was more important than anybody else, that everybody had a contribution to make to the thinking. At the appropriate time, they should bring in what they're thinking and feeling and so on. Second thing was we'd picked up this notion of fragmentation and the idea that the fragmentation is in human consciousness and then moves out into form. And what is this fragmentation? How does it happen? Where does it come from? So we weren't trying to resolve issues. We're trying to understand how fragmentation causes trouble, how fragmentation is created and how it's sustained. So in Israel at the time, there was, and still is, a lot of concern about Zionism. Zionism being on the part of some there, they believe that was really the core of the Israeli state, Zionism as against surrounding countries who had very different beliefs and politics and religion and so on. And others believed that Zionism would always be waving a red flag at their neighbours. So some believed without Zionism we would not survive, and others believed with Zionism we wouldn't survive. And that was one of the big crunches that came up in there, was that flaring of those two ideas.
Can I ask, you didn't convene a group to say, come and talk about these ideas?
No.
How did you convene the group? What did you invite people to?
We said we had a dialogue in UK, in Mickleton, and we started to realise that there is a different way of talking and thinking together, and that often we don't experience that because fragmentation interferes, and we're starting to explore that and to understand that. If you'd like to come and be with David Bohm and all of us, you're very welcome. Would you have liked to have been there?
I would love to have been there. Really, I would have loved to have been there, really. At the point at which, well, we'll come on to it as we go into different chapters of the book, but at the point at which it's experimental and really learning life from what's happening, rather than, I think, with dialogue, as with many things, then people have an idea about what it is and therefore try and replicate what they think it should be.
Yes.
And obviously we try not to do that, but to be there at the beginning, it would be, where I guess the kind of, it's unrepeatable learning, isn't it? Unrepeatable learning. But back to your experience there. So that was the invitation. How did the subject of Zionism then come up? You were just saying, say what's on your mind, and how does that come about? Because that then seems like a very focused inquiry to land on.
How we began was with David. Well, I think probably I welcomed people and explained what we had done in the previous meeting, and then David gave a little talk, and talking about wholeness and parts and fragments and some of the challenges we have when we try and talk and think together, and that we were looking to inquire into that. So he might have talked for 15 minutes or something like that. That set quite a scene. People realised that there was something they didn't know. And so people came with quite a humble attitude in a way, having heard him talk for 15 minutes. But also he wasn't trying to sell himself or ideas, he was trying to explore them. So it set a tone of inquiry, which was very helpful. And then from there, we'd open out into the conversation. We had concentric circles of chairs because we wanted to be close enough up to hear each other. And, if you go in rows, you've just got one person up front, like a monologue. So we deliberately made concentric circles of chairs.
Yeah, I want to ask a question. It may be useful to hear about some of the other sessions that you then went on to, but I'll ask my question and we'll find out. Because in your book, you go on to talk about dialogue in organisations, but here it wasn't an organisation. It wasn't your spiritual community. It was a mix of people, academic and spiritual. What relevance did that have to then how what unfolded in the dialogue itself?
That may be why it went to state level, the State of Israel level, partly because there were many Israelis there who were concerned about it, but a similar dialogue within an organisation or in a profession would likely go to the profession or the organisation. That was the kind of surround of it, I think.
So you found the thing that everybody there had in common.
And it was one meeting for one weekend. We quickly took the same format of meet Friday, have dinner together, have a session after dinner, Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening, Sunday morning. So we knew it was one-off and everybody would part. So in that sense, I think it naturally emerged that was of common concern to people.
Yeah. It's a contentious subject.
Life and death for people there.
Yeah. So how did you manage it? How did the group manage it so that it didn't end up in an argument and people leaving?
Well, it did end up in an argument. It didn't end up in people leaving, but we weren't trying to resolve it. we're trying to understand, is this a form of fragmentation? Now, how come we're getting stuck? How come we're defending and pushing and pulling? What's the process going on here? And those who were in the thick of it, who were getting pretty hot under the collar and accusatory of each other, were part of the group, but there were another 30 or 40 people who weren't in the mix of it, who were saying, I can kind of see how we end up in this kind of situation. So there were always some who were watching and then were able to comment and say, well, actually, when you started to use that word and that phrase, you tried to amplify it and so on. But we didn't feel our role was to resolve the situation for Israel. We felt it was to understand this process that we were contributing to right there and then.
What were they thinking and feeling by the end? Because I can imagine people saying, well, that was a talking shop. What are we going to do now? What comes out of this?
No, I think they were quite insight. There was a good insight that people had of how these situations are not only external. They're going on inside me, and I have to resolve a bit of this in myself to be able to contribute. And the minimum resolution would be to reduce the disturbance in myself enough to understand what you're saying. Because if it's more than that, I'm not listening, I'm preparing what I'm going to say next.
Yeah. Which comes back to me, and of course I can affect what I do, whereas expecting other people to do things is
And as I listen and say, well, what do you mean, Jane? You have a different space to speak into.
Yeah.
I have a different space to notice something.
Yeah.
So we certainly moved at times to quite a slow pace as people started to notice things. A lot of humour and a lot of fun. They're great fun in my experience, Israeli people, but also a lot of passion and a lot of concern.
Let's go into some of the other countries then. So this was an unfolding process. It wasn't a pre-designed series. Where did you go next?
Well, next, had a friend in Geneva who offered to host a dialogue. So we went to Switzerland.
You had friends in glamorous places.
And there was no centre there for the spiritual group I was part of, but we had enough following from Mickleton and from Jaffa that there was a group of people who were asking what's going to happen next. And they naturally spoke with friends. So we didn't publicly advertise anything. We simply said, okay, if you're up for doing that, we'll meet there. Where shall we meet? We found a little auberge in a place called La Ripe, which was lovely on the hills up above the lake. Partly we went there because David Bohm was going to go and meet Krishnamurti the following month in Shannon, which is not far away, where he used to give a talk every year. So we found this beautiful little auberge.
And we'll come to Krishnamurti in a minute. I'm thinking, that sounds such a wonderful way to create the next step and the next gathering. These days people would be saying to you, put it on LinkedIn and, what about your social media? But a very different process going on here.
There was a big challenge, however.
Go on.
The auberge, the patron, who was a chef, could not imagine that we were going to talk. He imagined we were going to eat. So we had our Friday evening and he served everybody aperitifs. And I'm thinking, we need to get through this meal where people have travelled, some from the US, they're quite tired. But he refills everybody's aperitif before he'd serve the starter. And in the end, I had to take him aside and say, we need menu B. We can't manage this.
And what, with this grouping, what if the key theme in Israel was Zionism, what emerged in Switzerland?
I believe, and we're going back in history now, but I believe this is where what I now call subgroups of spiritual people and scientists got into odds with each other. So it wasn't about Israel or about Switzerland. It was about in the room, many of the spiritual people were quite Pollyanna in their approach. Like, it'll all flow out of heaven and we're all fine. They had problems as well, but they tended not to think about that in the flow of things. The scientists were much more rigorous, like, we need proof or evidence about this. And people commented each in their own way. And at one point, somebody said, like this typical comment from the love group, a kind of innuendo of the love group being those people who believe that despite what you may or may not do, it'll all work out, kind of thing. And I think the love group didn't like that much and pushed back to say, no, this is what the implicate order and everything's all about, that it's all unfolding and integrated and fine. But they were doing it from a particular hymn sheet, I think. Eventually, the scientists in the room who were pushing hard, one of them said, well, if they're the love group, we must be the hate group. And that kind of cracked it, because they obviously didn't feel like a hate group at all. They felt rigorous, and it was a bit silly calling them a love group. And they kind of broke the labeling, which was causing the fragmentation at that point.
Yeah.
And people realized sometimes that labeling is external, but sometimes that labeling is going on inside me, like a bit of a dodgy group, that lot, or whatever. I've got a kind of way in which I'm thinking about them, which is causing the trouble.
Yeah.
But
do you think that pushing it was an important part to end up then, cracking, if that's the right word, that understanding of the impact of the labeling?
Yeah, it was the reactions which brought it all out. If everybody had been very thoughtful and said, well, I don't know that you are the hate group, really, we wouldn't have got there. It required spontaneity to reveal the problems of fragmentation. What David did immediately was pick up and say, well, why don't we explore hatred a bit? Not that you're the hate group, but actually, what about hatred? What about love? Really, love and hatred, how different are they? And I know we'd begun to talk about this a bit, and I know he had with Patrick de Maré, but when you explore it, when you love someone, you're preoccupied by them. You think about them all the time, whether they're there or not. When you hate someone, you think about them all the time, whether they're there or not. Actually, the dynamics are not so different. And started to explore, could hatred be transformed into love? Now we're talking about social issues that are quite deep between Hindus and Muslims, between Catholics and Protestants, all sorts of groupings where the hatred is involved. It seems impossible to move, is it? And that became a rather much deeper kind of inquiry, having blown off the froth on the earlier part of it. So
when something came up, rather than avoiding it or being delicate with it, you kind of got into it, you kind of
stayed with it and see, and what's happening here? So not only the content, but what's the process going on, which is leading to how we think about the content.
Can I ask then, so what was different in not only Jaffa and
La Ripe in Switzerland?
La Ripe, it was in Switzerland. And you, I know, went to other places all around the world. What was different about the way that people participated in these dialogues than how they would normally talk with others in a meeting or in a lecture theatre, wherever it would be? What was different?
What Don Factor and I, who continued the conversation all the time, noticed was that people were cautious to say in the dialogue what they would say in the coffee break or lunch break or afternoon. So the coffee break, saying, did you hear what he said? Rather than saying, what are you saying in the dialogue? And so in a way, the big difference was getting people to say in the room what they were saying outside the room. And that was the beginning of the facilitation, I think. David primed the pump with a talk, but the facilitation was, I think some people weren't so happy with what was said about hatred there, actually. Were they or not? And you could, and so I think that's the biggest difference, people saying what was otherwise hidden, that led them to start to reveal some of their thinking and feeling that was normally hidden. And rather than being suffering for that, it gave everybody more understanding and more information that I'm now feeling a bit vulnerable because she brought that up. And not saying, oh, we better resolve that, or you don't worry, as much as, okay, well, why is that? And what's that about? And so that was the main difference, I think.
Yeah, well, to develop that a bit, you talk in the book about, and it's in our work, about proprioception and proprioceptive awareness. Can you say a bit more for our listeners who won't understand that term?
Well, that's where we're going. What probably, if dialogue is a jargon word, I guess fragmentation, which is really how things are broken up in consciousness. Another became the word suspension. We were working in a room that had a chandelier and used that as a metaphor. If we could reveal what's going on inside us, we could look at it just like we can look at that chandelier, see how many lights, how it's structured, what it looks like, or just like if you have an object, you can turn it over and look at it. Could I myself bring out what I'm thinking and feeling and inquire into it, hold loosely what I might hold tightly, and explore whether it is valid or not? So doing that with others, that kind of suspension was where we were at this stage, I would say.
So in terms of your journey and your first-hand learning, you were learning more in practice, I guess, about David Bohm's ideas about fragmentation and the way people think or don't always think, and its impact on fragmentation.
Yeah, or the fact that in the room we just don't know what's going on. Mm-hmm. I don't really know where you are or what you're thinking or feeling and what your story is about what's happening or other people's. And that there's a way to start to bring that out into the open. Yeah. Well, this is directly related to main problems in the world. We don't understand why people would be disposed the way they are. We can get lost in that, or we can start to look at how it comes about. And that's what we were.
So you're now into a practice for you individually, but collectively, and how you can enable a group to go somewhere with this.
And also firsthand, because somebody would say, oh, well, of course, if you look at Piaget's work about how you learn to ride a bicycle, that's about tacit knowledge. What we're talking about is tacit knowledge. To say, well, maybe, but why are you now talking about Piaget? I don't think he's here. We haven't got any bicycles. So what's leading to talk about Piaget? Well, I thought it would help if I explained something. Well, what were you trying to explain, and why would it help others? So it sounds a bit convoluted, but it was really getting to what's going on here. The first-hand thing was the challenge. People had memories which were dominant. They didn't have space to suspend them and notice that they were using them. Yeah, that was the realization. Wow, I had to talk about Piaget. Why? Maybe because I felt I wasn't being noticed or something. Or you start to. I'll give you one example. The next dialogue we did, I think, was in Sweden, in Gothenburg. A man who was a herbalist, George Wickman there, invited us, and we gathered a group there. And beforehand, we had a little session. We arrived early. It was very interesting. I think David was there, I don't know, but Basil Hiley, his co-author, was there, and colleague and student, and a few others, and they were all mathematicians. So they had a mathematics gathering before the dialogue. And we went and joined in, and they said, well, let's show you how you invent mathematics. I'd like to know that. And they showed, well, you take some symbols, whatever, and you attribute some meaning to them. You say, well, that's always 3 times that, or this is that, or that. So you play around with them, and until you notice something interesting that you didn't realize before. So it's play, it's fun. What if we made it that instead of that? Or what if we divided, or what if and what would be another thing apart from multiplication, division, and addition, and make up a new form or whatever. When you notice something can work, then you start to play with it a bit more. most of it's failure, and you know that, but eventually you get something, and then you start to realize some qualities there which are quite useful. And you can do some things by using symbols in particular ways, and they demonstrated it in a way I'm not able to. I thought, wow, so this mathematics you're talking about, this work you're talking about, is really play. So, yeah. He said, do you know what happens after you've got it? So you teach people, you say you've got to do step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and then you get that answer. And that's not like play, not at all. He said, yeah, all people do is they learn the sequence of steps to use it. He said, but the essence of it, they don't get where it's come from, how it's arrived. And that stuck with me a lot, that what we were doing was not saying this is how you do dialogue. You do this and this and this, and then you'll get that. We weren't saying that. We were saying, what is happening at the moment? Where are we going?
But do you think humans, we look for those rules, that we look for the step 1, step 2, step 3, and it's, how do you stop people looking for that and trying to follow what they believe is the right thing to do?
Well, I don't know how I might have answered you then, but what I would say now is many people believe the knowledge is in the book. Knowledge is recorded and written down and you learn it. And the best you can do is go for best practice. Like, we'll use a chiropractor, an osteopath, some other medical treatment because you've got a sore back, best practice. What I think people don't realize is that you can generate your own knowledge. You can think together in a way that leads you to realize things which you know and which are useful. And so the starting point is, what is the situation? What's happening here? And I think the only way to get at that is to experience it, is really to almost make a game with a few rules, let people play it and discover, wow, yeah. I was listening differently then. Okay, well, what was the difference? And let them discover something. Yeah?
I think the listeners would enjoy the story about the woman bringing the piano into the dialogue, because I think, an extreme form of play, this might be the best. Say a bit about that.
I think you might enjoy that. Yeah, there was one dialogue, and I'm hard pressed to place which one it was, but it got to be quite challenging. And people were getting entrenched and quite aggressive. Nobody's going to hurt each other. These are all mature, professional, civilized people. But it was getting nasty. And it had gone for quite a while. Well, that wasn't a problem. I mean, to explore things, you do need to go for a while. Hard one is to explore boredom, because it gets interesting and you're not bored anymore. But in this case, it was just tough going and unpleasant. One woman just couldn't stand it. Others couldn't stand it in different ways. Some, I'm just not going to listen to it. Some, I got to make my point. They were pushing and pulling in all sorts of ways to deal with what they couldn't agree with and put right. She left the room, left the door open, and next door was a piano, and she's an elderly woman in her 60s. I'll explain the significance of it. When I was in Cape Town working in an insurance company, in the entrance lobby, there was a woman who was on reception, and she was about the same age, and she had a high desk. One day, a fire extinguisher fell off the wall, hit the floor, and went off. And this 6-year-old woman vaulted over the counter. She couldn't do it if she tried, but she vaulted over that counter and got to this. She thought it was life and death. This woman was almost at that level. She pushed that piano physically out of the room, through the doorway, into the room. She sat down and she started playing that piano. That was her trying to resolve that situation. It actually helped, but it was very extreme. I guess one thing to note here is these were not quiet, orderly, philosophical conversations at times. At times they were very different from that. Mm-hmm.
I know there are many, many stories of the things that happen in these different dialogues. We want our listeners to kind of get a feel for the energy of what was happening at that time as well. But I think we're already straying into chapter 8, which is about consolidation and dissolution. And so been hearing a bit about how your thinking developed. What also was happening in consolidation, I think, is that you were starting to get a bit of a reputation, you and David, and dialogue. And at this point, quite a number of big names come into the story. You've already mentioned Krishnamurti, but also the Dalai Lama, Václav Havel, and what was happening in became the Czech Republic. Do you want to say a little bit about some of those characters and how they played into the story?
Well, I could mention Jiddu Krishnamurti, his Indian philosopher, better known than David Bohm, very fine thinker. Again, I don't know if you know of him, but he was found by the Theosophical Society, who believed that there were reincarnations of people who were born to save the planet. Familiar story. And he was brought as a young boy back to England from India, where he was found, and put through public school. I think he went to Eton, I'm not sure, but he went through public school and took on that role of being the avatar, the person who knew, until he was about 34 when he renounced it. But he still had a great big following, and he every year spoke in 4 different places, India and California, Brockwood, and in Switzerland and so on. And so I had a chance to meet him through David. David Bohm had picked up an interest in the observer and the observed, which David was interested in terms of physics, how you set up the experiment. The observer affects the answer, the observed he looked at in terms of light, and Krishnamurti was doing that psychologically. And they formed quite a friendship, and they really went quite deep together. But David's inquiry within the dialogue group, and the dialogue groups we were managing, was for everybody to think together. Krishnamurti did monologues where everybody listened to Krishnamurti. Nobody else spoke. They all followed Krishnamurti's thinking and went deeper with it, which was quite powerful. But this was a different dynamic, and it did affect their relationship. So gradually, Krishnamurti knew David was working on the dialogue work, and gradually they started to move apart a little bit. It was a different dynamic. But he was a remarkable guy. The Dalai Lama I met through David again. He was interesting. His compassion and presence. I remember hearing him talk and acknowledging David sitting in the front row. I was along with him saying, "This is a wonderful man. He tells such wonderful stories about theoretical physics." But afterwards, I can't remember what he said. It was just like that original Human Unity conference. What he got was the deeper feeling of the pneumoplasm and the flow rather than the content, which he couldn't replicate. Václav Havel, like I mentioned, the book we published, I set up a publishing company to do it, Unfolding Meaning, for the first weekend. That got translated into Czech and typed up manually on typewriters and was distributed as what's called a samizdat. In other words, writing which is not legal to circulate, but which is of significance. And Havel and others who were in and out of prison and so on circulated that little weekend, which had never been advertised. And I think I sold 3,000 copies of the book, so pretty remarkable. But later I had a chance to meet him, meet his brother and her wife, his sister-in-law, I suppose. Actually, the same time we had that mathematics session. And in the dialogue, she spoke up, gave her views, and I could tell it was important. And I remember saying, you haven't probably been in a dialogue before, you haven't spoken up. She said, "I would never speak up." That in my culture, my husband is a mathematician, he's the man, and women don't speak. But you could tell how liberating it was that she did. And this Cheryl Bohm revealed the same thing. Said I would never speak at a seminar where David was doing his work. When David joined the Royal Society, which is the biggest honour he had, and kind of signed the same book as Isaac Newton had previously as a fellow of the Royal Society, she was too nervous to go. But in the dialogues, they spoke up, and you start to realise it somehow dealt with people who felt weaker, who felt less confident, who didn't believe they had something to offer. Not only could they offer, but they could offer something which, without which we wouldn't be able to proceed that well. So this whole issue of making things transparent and open so collectively we can understand how to proceed was very valuable for many people in different ways.
Won't be surprised to hear me say, but interesting to hear the women's names coming up in that context, because there's a lot of men's names as being the experts and the scientific kind of view, etc.
What does that say to you?
Well, so there's several things. One, that, as you said, they were both saying it's in their culture that it's the man. The other, that I think for the autobiographical journey of this story is a time and place that you were growing up and having these experiences. The other, that there's a bit of me that thinks there's still quite a lot of work to do in that direction for women. There are still an awful lot of areas that are where women's voices, because of the language that they speak, the way they talk, where the power is held, are still have some challenges coming through. So that's why I like the story of the woman pushing the piano in, because there are meetings that I've been at where I felt a bit like that.
I was thinking about a meeting I was in Bath University, and various speakers. A woman said something I thought was very interesting. The facilitator didn't hear it. Why? He didn't listen to women the same way as he listened to men, or certainly this woman. Later, a man made the same point. He said, "That's very interesting, isn't it? We should note that." I said to him, did you notice the woman over here said the same thing earlier? He said, "No, did you?" He said, "Well, yes, actually I did." And so I agree with you. This is quite subtle, the forms of fragmentation, aren't they?
Yeah, very, very. Well, I'm hoping that some of our listeners will be women and are scribbling in their journals at this point, because it's prompting some thoughts and experiences for them. I'd like to pick up on two things at this point. One, in our last episode, it were two men about to meet, you and David Bohm. You've both been through quite a lot together at this point. Just how was all of this affecting David Bohm first? Like, where was he? Because I have this picture in my mind of him being this kind of lone thinker. I think you've described in your book him sitting very quietly for long periods of time just thinking, but then in quite a dynamic process with lots of different people in lots of different places. So I wonder how he was at this point.
So I think he had plenty of colleagues at Birkbeck and was a teacher and lecturer as well as a thinker with colleagues. So, but equally, he did think all the time. So there were times when he just sat and thought about stuff. I think on his part, he had grown beyond what he could do with Krishnamurti, and he was playing in a space that he found to be very valuable and very interesting. He did move away from Brockwood School, where he'd been a trustee and so on, and made a different kind of space. I similarly moved away from the spiritual community. I closed down what I was doing there in an orderly way and felt this was the direction to go, that this gave me in a way, the dialogue work gave me the resolution of the physical, the intellectual, the emotional, in a way that was quite powerful for me. So that's kind of how we proceeded.
What did your wife think about this move? She'd been with you, obviously, we go back again to the last episode, out of society and then into the spiritual community, and you moving out obviously would have had an impact for her and your whole family.
Well, she is a wonderfully loyal wife. She headed off overland to India. She lived in a mud hut. She dropped out of society. She was happy to fast and be a vegetarian and wholeheartedly. She had worn thin on the spiritual community, which she felt was keeping us from developing. So she welcomed the shift that occurred with David Bohm and with Don and Anna Factor, and enjoyed the travel and enjoyed the sense that something new was opening up. I was still working full-time commercially, running different businesses, 3 different businesses, so I had a very active life. But I think she felt a liberation in moving out with that.
Yeah, this is quite a serious hobby you had on the side.
Well, it was a hobby. It was all just weekends and holiday.
But back to David Bohm, he also suffered severely with depression, I think. Say a bit about that and how that was relevant for what you were doing.
Well, it was Patrick de Maré who helped him with his depression, who was his psychotherapist. Yeah, it was interesting. With David, people have different stories about why he got depressed, and I guess it's different for everybody. But when you're depressed, you internalize. And I noticed at one point, you may know that the Iran-Iraq war, it gradually built up to become inevitable. These 2 countries were going to war, and which they did, and a large number of people died in that war. Spiritual community that I was in, I don't think they even noticed it. They were busy. For David, it was, what have we got to offer that could deal with this? Now, our dialogue is not well enough developed for these groupings to come together and do something different. And he really wanted to understand the root of the solution. In other words, what deeper down would lead to this working? Funnily enough, from your comments, I suggested it would probably be a meeting of the women rather than the men who would be killing each other, be a meeting of the women who may be able to do that, although women, of course, are also involved in the killing. But I think that led him to quite a depression. Had several of them. He went into Bethlehem Hospital in London. It used to be called Bedlam. And I saw him there. Took my son with me on one occasion when I saw him, and he was really done. Sitting in a bed, but he couldn't think.
One thing I think is worth picking up on from this phase was how you met Peter Senge, which I think was because David was sick. Was that right?
Yes.
Because again, I think
he also had surgery, and so it wasn't depression, but Peter Senge had written a book called The Fifth Discipline, and it had 5 disciplines in it, and one of them was based on dialogue, team development, and so on. He was at MIT and interested in organizational development. I believe he was at MIT, organizational development, and so on. And so I was invited to go and, instead of David, do some dialogues. So I thought, this is a great opportunity. Fly over. We were on the East Coast, Grafton, and I thought I better take some of David with me because they really want David, not me. So Don found a movie camera, and we got David out on the weekend, and we sat in a room with a couple of lamps facing him. It wasn't a top-notch studio, and we made 3 recordings. On the first one, Don cut off the top of David's head all the way, so you don't see the top of his head on the first half hour. The others, Don did better as a cameraman. And we asked him to talk a little bit about wholeness, parts, fragmentation, and its relevance to society and to the well-being of people. He did well with that. I was interested. What I discovered, I thought I've got to help David do this well. And I discovered he didn't need help. He actually needed questions he didn't know how to answer, which I could think. He didn't want just to replicate thought. And that's always been the problem with writing in a way. You fix things in a certain way, which is why I've been keen with this book to try to see that these are metaphors. They're real and they happened, but they're about the process more than they are about the content.
Yeah.
So we had 3 movies. I went to Grafton in Vermont, Peter Senge had brought together a group of business leaders, played a video for 20 minutes, and then had a dialogue. And they were really, really into it. I couldn't believe some of what I heard. Some of them stand up and starting saying prayers and things like that. It was a very unusual response, but they were deeply moved by what happened. And
I'm interested in then why dialogue. That sounds like you must have been excited, a great opportunity, business leaders, Peter Senge's book talking about dialogue. Did that get taken forward? How did it get taken forward by those people?
Well, it was the first dialogue I went to that I didn't organise. And I'd done a large number of dialogues. But the first one, somebody else convened the group and set it up. So it was a little different, stepping into the role of coming and bringing the dialogue in that way. And it was interesting being full of business leaders, but it raised issues. For example, many of people involved of a more spiritual background believe that you shouldn't charge money for dialogue. That dialogue is a spiritual practice and shouldn't be charged for. Don Factor agreed, which, being a bit pushed financially myself and him being a millionaire, I felt that made a difference to how he thought about it. Later, when I was invited and he might come along and we were going to get paid very well, he didn't seem so concerned about being paid. But these were real issues. Do you charge or not, and how do you do this? But it did open a door. Peter Senge said he would have written a book a bit differently if he'd had the experience of dialogue before he wrote it. Which is kind of interesting that one publishes what one hasn't experienced, which is very common, I think. And he picked it up and helped, in a way, a generation of business people think about dialogue and establish the Society of Organizational Learning in which this played a part.
We probably need to we're heading to the end of this episode and also then these chapters. And this was the point at which your partnership with David Bohm ended when he died.
Yeah.
Just say a little bit about David's death and what that meant to you.
I didn't walk out on him or something like that. He walked out on me. I had a phone call from Don Factor saying that this afternoon David died. And you don't, death's something you don't expect. It never happens when you expect it. Even if somebody's on their deathbed, it happens when you don't expect it. It's a curious one. But he worked his last day of life at Birkbeck College, as he had for about 22 years before. Full day's work, and caught a taxi home, as he was used to doing. When he arrived at his home, the taxi driver saw he'd gone to sleep, went to wake him up, and found he was dead. And my thinking was, what a fine way to depart, not putting work on anybody. To some people, it is a long journey dying and puts huge stress on their families and wives and financial situation. He's very clean in the way he did that, I thought. His last consideration, I found out later, was why do we identify with our bodies, our physical bodies? Why don't we identify, we could identify with any part of the cosmos? And so my thought was maybe he tried a little experiment. I'm keeping that in the back of my mind because it could be useful at some point for me, I think.
Lovely.
Went to his funeral, carried his coffin, got given his hat by his wife, which was a bit too big for me, which stops me being too arrogant, and on we went. There was no pause. We were going to continue.
Good. And we'll pick up on that next time. But I think now's probably a good time to hear from our guest this episode, from Matthew Capowski, who is the founder of the Bohm Society.
If thought is producing fragmentation, what allows thought to cease producing this and instead produce something more coherent?
Well, that's the kind of key question, isn't it? So I take my hat off to you, Matthew. That is a good inquiry. In that idea is thought producing fragmentation, and I think that's a part of it. I like to distinguish between thinking and thought. So thinking is an active process, and thought is an automatic process. Thought is based on memory, and we need thought. You can't drive a car without thought. You need, by reaction, put on the brakes. If you had to think it, like learner drivers have to, it's not so safe. So when you come to look at it, most of our life is driven, our lives are driven by thought, and it works. The problem is when it doesn't. And if we keep using thought when it doesn't work and push the thought we have harder, the memory, the way to do it harder, we hit problems. So we need thinking some of the time. So could say, well, if thought produces fragmentation, so the memories need to be updated, refreshed with others, how could this be different? Well, I think that's the essence of the question, I believe. How can we generate something different? Well, first we have to become aware that it's thought that's acting, and become aware we need some thinking, which is active. Now, that thought is very fast. It has to be to operate well. So becoming aware of it, you could say, if thought's the problem, how can we use thought to get out of the trap? We can't. We need something else, which you could call thinking. That's why we're talking about suspending what's going on in awareness. I notice these thoughts coming up. I notice this reaction. We're in a slightly different space when we're describing that. And the idea of suspension is to get to what you might call proprioception. Proprioception physically is the awareness that you're moving your body. You know, I'm aware I'm raising my leg under the desk or whatever, although I can't see it. I am aware that thought and thinking is going on or not. To become aware of that, so that kind of process can start to generate an understanding of wholeness, how things are connected. If you don't use that, you have to construct the solution. What we're talking about here is understanding how it's already connected. That is the revelation of how things are joined together. And that requires a different kind of thinking. The dialogue enables that because a lot of this is socially held, collectively held, and the dialogue enables the different perspectives to come. On your own, it's like a stuck record. On your own, with people who think the same way, it's like a stuck record. With others, the awareness can develop. The challenge can help you shift out of that. So clearly it's a longer answer needed and more of a inquiry together about it. So when I next talk with Matthew, that's where I'll be going.
Or maybe we could have a group of us together in a dialogue, because the collective inquiry
would be good.
Is, I think, important in what you're saying, not just doing on my own or just me and you, but the right kind of grouping to inquire together.
With women.
With women. Well. And listening to those women. Lovely. Right. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Jen.
Thanks for listening to A New Kind of Dialogue, the podcast, with me, Jane Ball, and Peter Garrett. If you're inspired by any of our thoughts today, visit dialogue-associates.com to find out more. Leave a review and give the show a 5-star rating if you enjoyed it, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Check out the show notes for extra information and links. Join us next time as we discuss chapters 9 and 10 of A New Kind of Dialogue, where Peter begins working within maximum security prisons.